Mr. Medellin here again. This is Mr. M, and right now we're going to be covering spatial resolution, also known as spatial frequency resolution, recorded detail, or spatial resolution, or definition. And the book that we're using here is the Radiographic Imaging book. This is the Principles of Radiographic Imaging, and where you can find this material is on page 386. It's chapter 28. Now, spatial resolution is going to be the sharpness of the structural edges, and it's measured in line pairs per millimeter. So there's a couple different things that are controlling spatial resolution, and there's a lot of influencing factors and another factor called geometric factors. So we're going to break that down for you today. So spatial resolution is one of the image quality factors. Spatial resolution used to be called recorded detail or definition in film screen imaging, but the ART has removed that information from the ART exam. So in the textbook, they'll still reference film screen imaging, but you don't have to worry about that. Another formula that they've taken off the ART exam is the penumbra formula, so we don't have to worry about that. So I'm not going to be including that in today's presentation, okay? So spatial resolution, again, is part of the image quality factors. I think I'm going to do a separate video and just go over the difference between prime exposure factors and image quality factors, and I'll talk about what controls what. So spatial resolution, spatial frequency resolution, all right? Spatial resolution is the sharpness of the edges, the structural edges, the sharpness of the lines of the edges of the object. That's spatial resolution. So sometimes some people get confused with contrast resolution, and we'll do a separate video for contrast resolution, but today we're going to focus on spatial resolution. So with spatial resolution, the controlling factor in digital imaging, okay, so digital imaging, if I can spell it correctly, right? Imaging. And that's one thing I've had to work on as a person, is just my spelling. So digital imaging, the controlling factor is going to be pixel size and pixel count. So this is going to be the controlling factor for digital imaging spatial resolution. There's other things involved that we'll discuss today, such as SNR, DQE, MTF. So we'll talk about how that influences the spatial resolution of the image itself. But I'm going to get started first on geometric factors. All right. So there's something called geometric factors. So geometric factors are going to be your OID, your SID, and your focal spot size selection. So focal spot size. So these are the three geometric factors. So OID is the object to image distance. SID is going to be your OID and your source to object distance, correct? So focal spot size is the size of the filament that you're selecting on the cathode that's going to have an impact on the stream of electrons that hit the anode and create the shadow around the object. So it has a factor on penumbra. So these are geometric factors. So the radiographic rule for geometric factors is you want to always minimize OID if you can, and you want to increase, or you want to go ahead and use the most practical SID that you possibly can. Now, focal spot size, the rule for the focal spot size is very similar to a grid. If you have a body part that is smaller than less than 10 to 12 centimeters, you can go ahead and use a small focal spot. All right, so if you want to get better resolution, you go down in focal spot size. So if you have a body part that measures less than 10 to 12 centimeters, you can use a small focal spot. But if you have a larger body part, let's say you're doing a lumbar spine, you have a large amount of mass you want to use, you're not going to be able to put all that heat on that little filament. You have to put it on a larger filament, so you have to use a large focal spot. So you're going to lose some detail, some spatial resolution, but you're able to apply more heat to the filament. All right, so again, it depends on the body part that we're using. So, but if you follow this rule here, this is going to always give you the most spatial resolution. So let's explain this here. So geometric factors, OID. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and draw this here. I'm gonna draw our X-ray tube. So you know this is your source of X-rays, right? So you're gonna go ahead and go through the collimator. So your distance from the source to your image receptor, your OID, this is known as your SID, correct? All right. Now, if you have an object here, this is your object, and we never reference the patient as an object, correct? We know that. But you have the object, the part, the medium, the tissue, the subject, right? You have all these different terms that we can use. You have the distance, all right? So let's say this is your IR. Your object to image receptor distance, that's OID, correct? So we have the OID, and then we have source to object distance. That's SOD. So when you take your SOD, let's say is, for example, let's say this is 36 inches, and your OID is 4 inches from the image receptor. If you add those two together, you're gonna get 40 inches of SID. All right, now I have this little thing that's helped me remember this for, 20, 27, 28 years. I say that SOD and OID get married and they have a baby named Sid. I know it's a little corny, but it's what's helped me remember this forever. All right, so again, your SOD and your OID give you your SID. So how does this relate to spatial resolution? Well, here's how it's gonna help us to understand this. You always wanna try to minimize your OID, and I'll give you the reason why. So let's say you have an OID that's going to be 2 inches, and you have another OID, I'll try to make it a little bigger, let's say it's 6 inches of OID. Alright. So when you have a decrease of OID, the shadow around the object is going to be smaller. As you increase your OID, the shadow of the object is going to be larger. Alright, so you're going to lose some of the spatial resolution. So as you decrease your OID, you're going to decrease magnification. I'm just going to put mag. And you're going to increase spatial resolution because the shadow around the object is going to be sharper. You're going to have less penumbra. Alright, so if you go up in OID, and this can help us with distortion as well. If you go up in OID, you're going to have more magnification. I was in lab earlier today and we were doing with the flashlight and we're showing them how when you increase the OID, my hand got bigger. So what I did was I turned on a light and I just brought my hand up and you can see that the shadow of my hand was increasing. So if I put my hand all the way down, the shadow around my fingers got smaller. And it's if I brought the OID up away from the table, then they can see that my hand got larger. So when you increase OID, you get more magnification. And when you do that, spatial resolution, spatial res is going to go down. Okay, so we'll call it spatial res, right? Because we're cool like that. Now, when you decrease OID, you get less magnification and that increases spatial resolution. Because magnification is distortion. And to be specific, it's size distortion. All right, we're going to do a separate video on distortion, but it's size distortion. So again, you always want to try to reduce the OID if you can. There's body parts that you can't, right? So we'll talk about that. But if you can, let's say you're doing a lateral lumbar spine, you can't get the spine any closer because it's in the middle of the back. All right. If you're doing a lateral cervical spine, you can't, take the neck off and put it up against the board. That'd be weird, gross. But you want to make sure that you increase your SID. So we're going to talk about some things like that. All right. So this is OID. Now, if we go to SID, you want to go ahead and increase your SID because it reduces magnification. Again, when you increase your SID, your magnification is going to go down. And anytime you have magnification that goes down, that's going to increase your spatial resolution. All right. So some people think that, you should bring your SID closer, but you actually cause more of a blurriness around the object. The shadow of the object becomes more blurry. So you want to make sure that you increase your SID to the highest practical. Right? Of course, you don't want to be on the other side of the room, like, oh, I'm going to increase the spatial resolution. It's not going to work that way. You got to use it to the most practical that you can, but you want to try to maximize your SID. All right? So, decreasing your SID, if you bring it down, you're going to increase your magnification. And anytime you increase magnification, spatial resolution is going to go down. All right? You know, I wonder if I can demonstrate geometric factors, correct? So now we're going to continue here with the focal spot size. So I'm going to show you here the focal spot size, and then we'll also demonstrate a couple different ideas inside the lab to show you exactly how this is all going to occur. All right, so you want to decrease your focal spot size selection. So I'm just going to put FSS, focal spot size. All right, so if you decrease your focal spot size, you're going to end up with less penumbra. So if you remember, penumbra, another word for penumbra was blur, correct? So is it 2 R's or 1 R? Is it 1 R? 1. 1, right? Okay, thank you. All right, so blur is going to be 1 R. My spelling, I told you earlier, that's something I've had to work on. I used to leave notes for my wife and she would correct them. I'm not lying. All right, so, all right, she's got issues. All right, so we all do, right? But anyways, that's her thing. Her strength is spelling and grammar. Mine is science and history and geography. All right, so focal spot size, you have less penumbra. So let me show you exactly what's happening. So inside your cathode, you have 2 filaments. All right, you have 2 filaments. So you have a large filament and a small filament. So remember, when you have the smaller filament, this is going to give us less penumbra, we said. And let me show you exactly how this is going to happen. So I'm going to draw here. This is your cathode and this is your anode, right? So let's go ahead and do this. Let's use red because of thermionic emission, right? So you have a stream of electrons. So the stream of electrons is going to hit the angle of the anode, correct? So the X-ray beam, when it comes down, let's see, I like this gold color here. You're going to have this X-ray beam come down, correct? So I'll use blue here for the object. So I'll use black for the shadow. So you're going to have a shadow around the object, correct? All right. Now, if you were to increase the size of the filament, the stream of electrons is going to be larger, correct? All right, so I'll use green for that one here. So now, if you increase the size of the filament, you're going to increase the size of the stream of electrons, so it's going to hit a larger surface area of the anode. So when the X-ray beam is produced, right, it's going to cast a larger shadow around the object. So let's say the size of the shadow is this big now. So you're gonna have more penumbra. But I'm gonna tell you right now, you guys, the digital systems do a really great job of creating an image where it kind of adjusts for that, and it's amazing, you guys. I was talking to somebody today, and they said, "Do you miss film screen imaging?" And I said, "I do, because it's kind of a lost art. You really had to know your technical factors." But I love the convenience and I love the technology that we use today because it really gives you a superb image. You really have to screw things up to get a bad image in digital systems. Usually it's incorrect positioning, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But again, so a large filament, you're going to have more shadow around the object. So that's going to decrease spatial resolution. It's not as significant as it was back then with film. With film, we can tell the difference. With digital systems, you really can't. And I think we have to do a better job of getting updated with the ART exam on some things that really don't happen anymore because it happened with film. Now, so I'm going to write this down. So a smaller filament is going to give us a smaller focal spot size. So we have the actual focus spot, and then we have the effective focus spot. There's 2. The actual focus spot is the area of the electrons where it hits the surface, where it actually bombards it. That's going to be the actual focus spot. So if the larger the focus spot, you're going to have a larger effective beam, and that's going to cast a larger shadow on the object. So if you have a smaller actual focal spot, you have a smaller effective beam that's going to give you less shadow around the object. So the smaller the filament, the smaller the focal spot, you're going to have less penumbra. Okay, we say you're going to have less blur, and that's going to increase spatial resolution. All right, so that's going to increase spatial resolution. Now, the opposite is true. You know what's funny, and I tell the students this all the time, if you have one idea and you know that idea, and the opposite will give you the total opposite reaction, you really just have to focus on the one. Because if you know that the opposite is going to occur and you'll have the opposite reaction, you don't have to put your attention to both of them, right? So if you have a larger filament, you're going to have a larger focal spot, you're going to have more penumbra, and spatial resolution is going to go down. So it's the opposite. So these are your geometric factors. Now, there's another contributing factor to spatial resolution, and it's going to be motion. All right, so motion. Now, we don't want any type of motion to occur on the image, none. So motion, you can have voluntary motion, you can have involuntary motion, and you can have equipment or mechanical motion. Now, you don't want any one of these, okay? Equipment or mechanical motion. You don't want any motion. There's a question that we ask the students, and we say, which of the following motions will affect the image the most? And it's all of them, because you don't want any type of motion. Now, voluntary motion is under the conscious control of the patient. So this is where if you tell a patient to do something, right, and they don't do it, or they do the opposite, that's voluntary motion. They can hold their breath or they can't hold their breath. If you tell them to hold still and they move, right, there's something that I learned as a tech a long time ago. Some patients think that the collimator light is the x-ray beam. Now they don't know, right, but it's something we know as techs. And what I used to do is I used to turn on the collimator, position my patient for a hand or a wrist, and then I walk away and I make the exposure and they move because the collimation light would turn off. So I had to tell them, you know what, this little light might turn off, but that's okay. Just hold still and do not move until I tell you to move. So voluntary motion, that can be fixed easily by just communicating with the patient. So I tell them, and this is a little joke, I get patients, they say, what if there's an earthquake? And I say, well, let me get the x-ray done first and then we'll duck and cover together on the table. All right, so I do MRI, or I used to do MRI, and the patient's like, you're gonna leave me if there's an earthquake. I'm like, no, I'm gonna squeeze in there with you because it's a safe place to be, right? So, voluntary motion, under the conscious control of the patient. Involuntary motion, they can't control it. They can't control peristalsis activity. They can't control their heart beating. You're going to tell the patient, we're going to stop your heart from beating, but don't worry, I got you, right? We got an AED here. We're going to get the best chest x-ray ever. No. You're going to go ahead and you're going to decrease your exposure time so you don't capture that involuntary motion. So voluntary motion, we say, can be fixed by communication. Involuntary motion, you can use a faster exposure time. This is where reciprocity comes into play. Use a higher MA and go down your exposure time, and boom, you can get that image with the same exposure, but a faster time. So involuntary motion, peristalsis, the heart beating, tremors. If they're cold, give them a warm blanket, right? You can't change the temperature in the room. It's always cold in the x-ray room, right? But give them a warm blanket, or maybe talk to them, help them calm their nerves. The last one here is mechanical or equipment. Do you remember we said in a previous video, we're talking about grids? Well, grids, there's two types of grids. There's stationary and there's moving grids called a bucky. Well, if you turn on the bucky and it vibrates underneath the patient and you don't need to turn on the bucky, you can have the grid moving or causing the vibration. Or if your x-ray tube, this is why I'm a big proponent of people using the x-ray tube locks appropriately, because if you move the x-ray tube without hitting those locks, it's going to slide, it's going to move, whether up and down or longitudinal, it doesn't matter. If you don't use the locks accordingly, it's going to go ahead and strip the locks, and before you know it, your x-ray tube is going to move. If you have your angle perpendicular and it starts to swing down slowly as you're taking the x-ray, that's because the locks are stripped. So mechanical motion is coming from the equipment. So neither of these we want on the image, because when you have motion, it's going to cause blur, it's going to cause penumbra, and whenever you have penumbra, what did we learn? It's going to degrade the spatial resolution. So this is going to be motion, all right? Now, we're going to go ahead and go into digital components. So digital factors. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to list them, and then I'll do a separate video just on digital components and how it affects the imaging itself. Right now I'm just going to list them, and we're going to talk about what they do for spatial resolution. So we said that you want to decrease your pixel size and you want to increase your pixel count. So think about your TVs, right? You want the smallest pixel and more of them, right? So if you're buying a TV, you want to get the most with the most pixels, and you want a larger matrix, right? You want a larger field of view, you want a larger matrix, but you want smaller pixels to give you a better picture, I should say. So pixel size, you want it to go down, but you want the pixel count to go up, and you want to have a larger matrix with smaller pixels. All right? So we said that these were the controlling factors for spatial resolution in digital systems. Now, SNR, signal to noise ratio. We know that when X-rays go through an object, that's signal, right? The radiation that's coming from the X-ray tube, the primary radiation, useful beam or positive beam, it's going to interact with the body. It's going to go through the body. It's called exit or remnant radiation. That's still signal. It's going to hit the detector. So you always want to have a higher signal, and you want to get lower noise. Okay? So this is called SNR. We have SNR in digital imaging, X-rays, we have it in CT, we have it in MRI. So again, signal to noise ratio, you want to get more signal and lower noise because noise will degrade the image. We have another term called DQE. You want DQE to go up, detective quantum efficiency. Again, I'll do a separate video for all these digital terms. Detective quantum efficiency is a predetermined exposure that's going to be comparing the input versus output, how much signal that's recorded and how much of the signal is being used to create the image. You want to get a higher DQE. More DQE means more signal. More signal is better spatial resolution. The other one is going to be MTF, modulation transfer function. That's the fidelity of the signal. How much of that signal is actually going to be used to create the image that's pure. And again, signal is lost during the construction of an image. I believe on a good MTF, it's 80%. DQE is about 68% for a good system. But again, you want a higher modulation transfer function because you're getting more signal that can be used to create the image. The other one's going to be fill factor. Again, I'll do a separate video on just these items themselves for digital radiography, but you want to increase the surface area of the detector element. So, remember, you have acquisition pixels. So a larger fill factor means you have more of an active area for the signal to be recorded. So imagine your old school televisions have this big box of a frame, right? The old school TV